All early societies operated on credit long before there was money. For instance, their Wehrgeld. If you injured somebody, then you had to pay them compensation. If they hadn't arranged that kind of uh, compensation, then there would have been feud justice. People would think, well, you injured a member of my family, I'm going to injure a member of yours. So people had to pay Wehrgeld. That meant man price for any injury. But because they didn't have money, it was usually in the form of uh, set a basket of commodities that they would have. There was bride price. If you would have a daughter getting married, you had to provide a dowry for her. But even more important than that, for all of the indigenous societies, communities, investigated by anthropologists, everybody was in debt to everybody else through gift exchange. For instance, even though everybody was growing crops for themselves, they would give crops to a neighbor and to friends, and that would cause a reciprocal obligation to give their crops back. And the whole idea of credit originally was to integrate societies, not drive them apart as today. Well, gradually, these societies developed, and the debts were bound to develop more as you had a specialization of labor. And that occurred primarily in Mesopotamia, because that had the large institutions, the temples and the palaces. And when you have large institutions, you have to have resource allocation. That meant you had to have some standard of value to measure. And the standard of value was for the domestic agricultural sector, grain. Many of the rulers, when they would come in, would announce a price schedule. One unit of grain would be equal to one shekel of silver, so that there would be a communication. Sometimes they would add copper, sometimes they would add wool, all sorts of other things, so that there was generally a means of transactions between the communal sector, the families on the land, and the palaces and the temples that had dependent labor. For instance, war widows and orphans were working in the temples, weaving textiles and other things. But even before that, you had the kind of debts that were attached to the land. And sometime in the Stone Age, land began to be assigned to people. You couldn't just grab whoever settles here first gets to keep the land. It was all pretty homogeneous, and land was assigned to citizens on a fairly standardized unit in exchange for the citizens' liability to owe the community two things. The citizens had to fight in the army for the men, and they had to work on the corvée labor, that is for infrastructure projects. And when they were not working on the land to do harvesting, they would be working on building irrigation ditches, building the ziggurat temple pyramids, building the walls. And so the land was allocated to families so that they could feed themselves and have enough crop left over to give to the palace or for the temples for various services. You would have to pay the temple priest for marriages, for burials, and you had the division of labor all settled by credit. And the economy basically still worked on a credit economy with these mutual obligations. And problematic personal debts didn't really develop until maybe the third millennium BC is where we begin to have the first real clean slates. So suppose that the economy worked on credit during the crop year because there wasn't any grain to pay because it wasn't harvested yet. And so if people would go to the local bar, to the ale house, they would have ale, and the proprietor woman would mark it up on the slate, just like you go into a bar and you pay on payday. But the payday in the Bronze Age was when the crop was in, and at that point, the cultivators would then bring their crop to the temples. It would all be measured out on the threshing floor, and they would measure out how much do you owe to the alewoman, how much do you owe to the temple, how much do you get to keep for yourself. All of that, all of that was a kind of working in kind, and money was only used really at harvest time because that was the only time it appeared. Well, all the way down to the medieval period, by the 12th and 13th century in England, for instance, that operated the same way. The serfs or cultivators would operate on credit during the crop year. Money would finally come in when they would grow the crop. They would sell it. They would use the money to pay whoever they owed money to, and essentially that would clear the slate for again. But what happened if the crops failed? There could be a drought, there could be a flood, or there could be military operations. And so when that happened, the palace said, well, we can't have the cultivators unable to pay the debts, because if you couldn't pay the debt to someone you owed it to, you had to work it off in labor. And in fact, one of the first way of getting labor for hire was to lend money to someone and say, well, you can work it off. We want your labor power. And if the ruler, the king, did not say, all right, there's a flood, a drought, you don't have to pay. In Hammurabi's laws, it says if the storm god Adad floods the land, the debts don't get paid. Because otherwise you'd have everybody, all of a sudden, you'd have the cultivators falling into bondage to their creditors. And some people, in any case, had to borrow money, even beyond what they could pay, even in normal times. They could get sick, they could need special help, there could be all sorts of problems, and you had to work off the debt, often in the form of bondage. You wouldn't necessarily have to live at the creditor's house, but often the borrower, the head of the man at the head of the family, would say, well, take my slave girl. For instance, I'll pledge my slave girl to you as collateral to get back, or even their wife or their daughter. And so the economy tended to get out of balance in time, and rulers would come in and around 2500 BC, just start, okay, we're going to start a clean slate. We're going to wipe out the problematic debt so that everybody can basically be in balance, and we can keep restoring a kind of idealized status quo ante, the way the world was before it got out of kilter. And that was the whole idea. There was a kind of idea of a norm. And fortunately, there was no Milton Friedman or Chicago school people to say, well, everything's going to work out automatically. The Bronze Age rulers were much smarter than the modern economists. They knew that economies tended to polarize, and the main cause of polarization was debt. And the way to get rid of it was simply to cancel the debts and put everybody on an equal footing once again.
But when exactly did rulers decide that perhaps it was a good time for debt cancellation?
Well, there were two occasions. When any new ruler took the throne, he said, well, I'm going to start my throne I'm going to be a good ruler. I'm going to start the throne with everything in balance. We're going to cancel the debts and begin my rule in balance. And hopefully we're going to keep things that way. So a new ruler would be crowned, and usually it was called on his second year of the year names for the rulers. They'd say he proclaims justice. And there would be at some point after the coronation, and we don't know exactly when. It could have been harvest time that the ruler would do that. Or it would be at harvest time, or there would be a military conquest. And for instance, when Hammurabi conquered some of the neighboring regions, he proclaimed a debt cancellation for the region. Number one, by liberating all of the debt bond persons, he got the support of all of the people in these regions. And also, that was sort of like, just like I, Hammurabi, canceled all the debts when I took the throne. I'm doing it for you because you're part of my region, and this is the beginning of my reign over you people in Larsa or wherever else they were there.
But just to clarify this point, what were the kinds of debts that were canceled exactly? Was it only personal debts or also commercial debts?
Only personal debts.
Okay.
The other form of debt, of course, was trade debt, and that developed in Sumer because Mesopotamia had very rich land that was deposited over millions of years by sediment, by the rivers overflowing and giving it very rich land, but it didn't have stone or metal. And so Sumer, the Sumerians had to trade for their raw materials. And what they did was they exchanged the palace, the temples, or even private landowners. We don't know too much about how they developed, but they would consign textiles or handicrafts to merchants. And they said, well, the idea is we want to share. We're going to give you the consignment of the textile. We want you get half the profits, we get half the profits. But at that time, nobody expected the merchants to actually keep record books of how much they traded and what they got back. So the deal was, you're going to have to pay us. We give you 1 mina, you'll have to pay us back in 2 minas of silver, 100%. The debt will double in 5 years. That was a normal commercial loan. And the merchants would have basically, obviously, they made a very large trade because 5 years doubling time works out to 20% per year in normal interest. And it's possible that merchants would run into debt to each other. They were all part of a community in any local city where they developed up as you went into Anatolia or into Iran or elsewhere. There'd be local groups. And it's possible that merchants couldn't pay the debts to other merchants, but no matter what, they would still always have their own self-support lands. If worse came to worse, because as citizens, they all had the self-support lands. And so they were protected by the fact that everybody gets, as a human right, the basic means of self-support. So the commercial debts were not canceled. That was left. Those debts were denominated in silver. So when the Babylonian rulers, Hammurabi's dynasty and other people in the early second millennium, it was around 1750 BC, would cancel the debts, they would always specify that these were the barley debts that were canceled, not the silver debts that were left in place. Just like today, the problematic debts that everybody wants to be canceled are the student loan debts and the personal bankruptcy for people who couldn't pay. But they're not really canceling business debts. If there's a bankruptcy, you lose the property.
Since you mentioned interest and interest rates there, how was interest-bearing debt invented?
Well, originally, as I said, it was part of the profit-sharing agreement in foreign trade for silver debts. And it took a long time for me to figure out how you got the interest. How did this spread to the agricultural sector? Well, the palace had agreements with the community that the palace had its own lands and the temples had their own lands, and they would lend these lands to sharecroppers in exchange for 1/3 of the crop. And so somehow they said, all right, well, just as we get 1/3 of the return for land, if we give you money, the interest rate for barley debts is 1/3 of the principal. Sometimes the creditor would charge 1/3, even if it wasn't an entire year. We found in the records, but it was supposed to be 1/3. And in Hammurabi's laws, he specifies silver debts have to pay 20% per year. But he didn't say 20% because they didn't use the decimal system. They used the sexagesimal system that is based on 60s. Just as you have 60 seconds in a minute, you had 60 shekels in a silver mina, and one shekel per mina per month works out to 12 shekels a year. That's the 12 over 60. That's 20%. Well, that became the standard, and they expressed this in a kind of poetic metaphor. They said the mina gives birth to a shekel, and it gave birth to it on the new moon. And every new moon, every month, there would be another shekel born to this mina of debt, or proportionally, whatever there was. So money was the payment of interest was thought of reproducing itself just like an animal. Well, by the time that Aristotle tried to figure out how money and interest came into being, the fact that the Sumerians called interest mash, which was the word for a young goat, because they said, well, for the metaphor, just as a mina gives birth to a shekel, it's sort of like a goat giving birth. That was their image for giving birth. Because obviously silver doesn't reproduce, as Aristotle noticed. So you would have the mina giving birth as mash. Well, by the time the idea of charging interest was brought to the West in the 8th century BC, the interest was called tokos, which was a young cattle in Greek, or phenos, as in fertile, for which was the word for cattle in Rome. And they had the same idea that you had in Sumer of giving birth. Well, but they didn't use the 60-base system. Greece used the Egyptian decimal system, so the rate of interest was decimalized. Either it was 10% a year, or it was 1% per month. And in Rome, it was 1/12. Rome used the duodecimal system based on 12ths. There were 12 troy ounces in a pound. And so the pound gave birth to an ounce once a year. So you had the same metaphor of giving birth, but they used the word for animal. And Aristotle said, well, this doesn't make any sense at all because silver is a barren metal. It doesn't really give birth. He didn't realize how metaphoric the idea is. And of course, when you have economists try to write ancient history, they're the one group that should not write about ancient history, because they think, how would we organize a Sumerian Bronze Age economy if we went back in a time machine? They'd think, oh, well, I guess the original form of interest was people would lend cows. And they'd get the calves as interest. And anthropologists have found no society anywhere in the world where cows are lent out. cows are pledged as collateral and they're lost to creditors, but they're not. Most loans are not very productive. Well, if debts got too high, then the creditors would get too rich. And the problem, if debts got too high, you would have much of the labor falling into bondage to the creditors. Well, the creditors wanted their labor. So the labor, if you were in bondage to a creditor, you'd have to spend your time cultivating his land, not your own land. And if you had to do that, then number one, you wouldn't be able to work at corvée labor, because you'd be working for the private creditor, or you wouldn't be able to serve in the army because you were a bond person and couldn't serve. And so there was something even worse, that as you have a creditor class get wealthy, it became a power in itself to rival the palace. And if you have the creditor class wanting to rival the palace and even overthrow the rulers, well, the first thing they would do would be to stop debt cancellation. That's what happened in antiquity, but it didn't happen in the Near East, because the Near East was able to prevent an independent creditor oligarchy from developing. We do find cases of some creditors who got very rich, got a lot of land from that they had foreclosed on from their creditors, but then a generation or two later, we don't find them at all. Somehow they were treated like China would treat billionaires who have a little too much money. Somehow the lands were all returned to their original owners, and this was this was spelled out in Hammurabi's debt cancellations and those of his grandsons and great grandsons. And the debt cancellations were part of a broader restoration of order. In addition to freeing the bond servants and saying, now you don't owe any more money, you can go back to your land, and your slave girls will be returned to you from the creditor. You would also cancel cancel any of the lands that they lost. That you would return the land to them, as well as giving them the freedom. So you had debt cancellation going together with freeing the bond servants and restoring the land. And the word that Hammurabi used, the Babylonian word, was andararam. Well, this is the word that in the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews were relocated to Babylon after they lost the war, they became familiar with all of these Mesopotamian practices and brought them back to Judea. And the Hebrew word that was used in Leviticus 25, the Jubilee year, was duror. And duror is the exact cognate to andararam. That the first labor for hire was you'd make a loan to the labor, and he would have to repay you by working off the loan. And that was basically how you'd get labor. Well, pretty soon, this idea of lending money and getting repaid became abbreviated into, well, we don't have to go through the lending process. We'll just pay you, pay you for this instead of you having to work it off a debt. We'll just instead of paying you in advance by giving you a loan, we'll pay you for what you're working on. So it really was debt bondage that was the first form of labor for hire, and that evolved into it. Greece was the West were the barbarians at this time. All of this all of the basic elements of commerce and economic relationships were developed in Mesopotamia and the other Near Eastern countries. There had been really bad weather around 1200 BC. You had a depopulation of the whole Near Eastern region all the way into the Mediterranean. And you had a population collapse, for instance, in Greece. You had the Mycenaean palace economies that used linear B. the palace economies fell apart, and the local district managers who would manage a local district on behalf of the palace ruler. Once there was no more palace ruler, the manager would become the local king. And you could see this in the language that they had. Or there were warlords and mafia type of people. Well, at any rate, by the 8th century BC, and we're talking about 400 years after there was a drought or something like a drought, when this went all the way from India all the way to the Mediterranean. It looked like it was a global phenomenon that just ended whole cultures. Well, by the time the Syrian and the Phoenician traders began to get ships and began to trade again, they moved westward into Greece and into Italy. And the people they would deal with, you'd land usually on an island right outside the big city, sort of a neutral zone. And the people you talk to would be the local chieftains. And you'd explain to them how the financial system worked and said, all right, we're going to trade these goods for your goods, and we need to be paid in money, and we charge interest. So this idea of charging interest was brought from the Near East to Greece and Italy. But Greece and Italy didn't have any palace rulers because they all disappeared in 1200 BC. All they had was local chieftains, and these were sort of mafia, either warlord types, just sort of grabbers. So they were the people who'd grabbed power either because they just kept the local means of production when the Mycenaean palaces fell apart, or they were warlords, or they were just local big men, ambitious. Sort of, it was a free-for-all, sort of like Russia after 1991. And these are the people that said, well, all right, this idea of lending money is very good. And they began to lend money to their countrymen and charge interest, but there was no ruler to cancel the debts. And so you had pretty quickly the powerful families taking over all of the land in the Greek cities, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and in the various Italian cities, whether it was Rome or the Etruscan cities or others. And these cities were not very pleasant places to live, and you had you had in the West what would have happened in Mesopotamia if they didn't cancel the debts. You had a creditor oligarchy developing. Well, there was a revolution almost everywhere. Finally, the people rose up. I shouldn't say the people. There were most of these revolutions, like in Corinth. It's shown the best. You had minor members of the wealthy families saying this isn't fair. Well, maybe they thought it wasn't fair that they didn't get as much as the richer members of the family, but they led a populist revolution. They overthrew the mafia type dictators. By the way, a lot of classical historians use the word mafiosi type leaders for what was before the 8th century. It's not my term. I picked it up from von Wies and other people that have used it. So they would overthrow it, and they would do essentially what the Mesopotamian rulers did. They say, okay, we've overthrown the wealthy people that have kept you in debt. We're canceling the debts, and we're redistributing the land so you can all have the land. And we're going to be good rulers. We're going to develop public infrastructure. We're going to develop trade. We're going to develop commerce. We're going to make you all rich. That's what happened in Corinth. In Sparta, there was a similar fight, and they said, "Whoa, we're not only going to cancel debts, we're going to get rid of money itself. we're not going to use silver. We are going to use a kind of iron, but just to make sure that you don't think that money's a commodity, that you realize that money is created by the public sector. We're going to dip the iron and we make it in vinegar so that it's all blistered and it's not practical. So they got rid of the actual money, although the Spartan elites kept their own property in Sparta itself, and it was on the land outside of Sparta that Sparta essentially conquered the neighboring population and made them into helots, which is a kind of serfdom, where they had to work supplying food for the Spartan homoi, the equals, men. Well, finally, by 490 BC, you had the most backward country in city-state in Greece, Athens, finally had its own revolution. And they wanted to do in Athens what they'd done in these other countries. And so to prevent a revolution, they appointed Solon as the archon, meaning, okay, you're going to be the ruler, you'll settle things. Solon canceled the debts, mainly the mortgage debts that held the people to the land. We're still not sure exactly what happened, but he did cancel the debts, but he didn't redistribute the land. And that disappointed the population so much that they sort of forced Solon into exile. And the real fight for democracy was led by, as it is today, by people who the creditors call dictators or tyrants. And that was the followers through the balance of the sixth century, who had bodyguards and everything, until finally, by the end of the 6th century, you had another minor member of one of the richest families in Greece, Cleisthenes, who was an Alcmenion family, doing what Stalin never really did, and reorganized the voting system and really created the Athenian democracy. You had Solon gave, when he left, the Pisistratus was taken over. He was called a dictator because he was a populist and supported democracy for the people. He was starting building. He was putting the people to work and giving them jobs. So, of course, he was denounced by the other people. Finally, you have Cleisthenes that established the democracy. So you had, but all the same, you never had in Greece or Rome a ruler that would cancel the debts. For 5 centuries, you had the populations revolting in civil war. They wanted to get back to a ruler that was like the Mesopotamian rulers, like Hammurabi or the Sumerians, the others who canceled the debts. And antiquity never had that. And that's what made Western civilization different from the Middle Eastern civilization. They didn't have a central ruler. The so-called democracy wanted the debts to be canceled. They wanted the land to be redistributed. And so Aristotle, when he wrote a study of the Greek constitutions, said, well, all the constitutions call themselves democratic, but they're really oligarchic. Because under a democracy, you're going to have wealthy people developing, and they become an oligarchy, and then they make themselves hereditary into an aristocracy. And finally, some member of the aristocracy fights with other members of the aristocracy and takes the people into their camp. In other words, becomes a populist and said, hey, I want your support in overthrowing this aristocracy. And the whole thing starts all over again. See, with the Dark Age, you could say, the legacy was the oligarchy took over. Rome ended up conquering Greece and all the other areas. And it was the most vicious oligarchy. Rome began essentially as a city of refuge, meaning runaways. And in one of the reasons I should have said that the Babylonian rulers canceled the debts is if they wouldn't have canceled the debts and the bond persons, the bond servants would have simply run away. And there was a labor shortage in archaic times. Everybody really wanted to get labor. That was the golden time to be a laborer because everybody wanted you to be part of their community. Well, what Rome said was, well, here we are on the Tiber River. There are a lot of mosquitoes here. Nobody really wants to live here. It's there's water is good for trade, but not good if you don't want mosquitoes around. So how are we going to get people here? Well, the kings of Rome said, all right, fugitives, if you come here and you're not able to get much land for yourself or an alternative to bondage and these other nasty Italian mafia communities that there are, come on to here. We'll give you land. We'll treat you fairly. And so Rome became a magnet for people to grow rapidly, and the kings took over. But also you had by the late 6th century, the late 500s, you had even aristocrats in other Italian cities fighting with each other and moving to Rome, and they merged with other aristocrats and they overthrew the kings. And when they overthrew the kings, they stopped the ability of kings to treat the population fairly, and they introduced the class war and immediately clamped down on the population. We're not going to, if you fall into debt, you're going to be our debt servants forever. There's no reversibility of debt, as there was. There's no circular time. There's linear time. You lose the land, it's it. You're not going to get it back. Well, in 490, the citizens of Rome, there was a walkout. It's called the secession of the plebs in 490. And they decided to walk out and said, well, we're not going to be a part of your community. It was a nice while it lasted, but we're going to go somewhere else. So there was a lot of negotiation. And then they realized, well, where are we going to go? Because all the other cities around us are pretty rotten oligarchies too. So they came back with the oligarchy making promise, but an ancient oligarchy making a promise to the people is sort of like the United States making a promise to other countries internationally. They immediately broke all of their words, and there was another walkout in around 450 BC, and they said, look, we've got it right. We're not going to trust you again. What you promise us, write it all down. So they wrote the law of the 12 tables, and that's where they established, here's the interest rate that you have to pay, here are the terms. They at least wrote everything down. And what they wrote was a pretty oligarchic set of laws. Well, this tradition of creditor-oriented laws, all debts must be paid. There's not going to be any debt forgiveness. Once you lose land or sell it, you're never going to get it back. Linear time. All this whole Roman spirit of the law is oligarchies can control society. There's not ever going to be a democracy under our rule. That is what polarized Rome more and more. Every century there were revolts against the oligarchy, and they all failed because the oligarchy was controlled the heavily armed military and essentially political assassination. Again, already in Rome found the same policy that the United States does. If there's somebody who's advocating fair trade for the people, fair deal, you assassinate them. And the Roman history is marked with political assassination, just like the United States does in throughout Latin America and other countries, or Israel has just done against the Iranians in consulate in in Syria. So political assassination, and finally there was in the first century BC there was outright war in the Catiline. Was one of the aristocrats. Almost all the revolutions were led by aristocrats. Not some, but they would mobilize the people, and they would get together and essentially take the people into their camp as a populist and try to fight. They were utterly destroyed. And finally, one of the early supporters of Catiline, Julius Caesar, organized an army, marched on Rome, became the leader, and we all know what happened to him. He was killed in the Senate. And the result is that Rome got essentially ended up the Roman Empire in a series of large manors held by on the land, held by the wealthiest families, and the trade dried up, the population shrunk, and you ended up with a dark age. Which is what happens when you don't cancel the debts, you don't redistribute the land, and when a society polarizes and sucks all the income and control over labor to a narrow elite at the top of the pyramid, a creditor landowning oligarchy, the result's always going to be a dark age, because you've killed the internal market, you've killed all forms of economic growth.
Correct.
Yes. Yes, that's what oligarchies do. They stultify, just like in the United States and Europe today. You have a financial oligarchy emerging, and the result is de-industrialization. Because if you impoverish the economy, you're not going to have industry anymore. You're going to have basically self-sufficient enclaves of a few families run everything. And basically, the problem with the financial sector, with creditors throughout history, is they live in the short run. They don't care that they're bringing a dark age. All they care about is right now. Just like corporate managers just care, well, what are the earnings going to be in the next quarter? What are the year's earnings going to be on which my bonuses are based? And so they lead the corporation instead of using the corporate profits to make new factories and new machinery, more labor and production. They say, well, we're not going to reinvest profits. We're not going to put money into research and development because we're going to be leaving the company by then. Let's just use the profits to pay dividends to push up the stock price, and let's use the profits for stock buybacks, and we'll make the stock go up, and our bonuses are based on what we do with the stock. So essentially, the financial sector today is really doing just what the financial sector did in Roman times. They ended up lending money to other parts of the richest part of the neighboring geographic area, which was Asia Minor. They essentially took over, they looted the temples, they looted the palace of all the money, they privatized. They did what Margaret Thatcher would have done. They privatized all of the public utilities and essentially impoverished the population. And what they did to Asia Minor, there was a revolution there by Mithridates, that ended up on one occasion killing 80,000 Romans who had gone throughout the Near East as public and tax collectors or creditors or just financial adventurers and merchants. Rome retaliated not only against Asia Minor, but it destroyed Athens totally, wiped it out, destroyed Sparta almost totally. And tried to lay waste to the whole world. They did to the rest of Greece what the United States has done to Latin America, Libya, and much of the Near East. You could say they were the first Americans in terms of foreign policy.
Let me ask you this question. What about debt that countries owe each other? Could that kind of debt also be canceled?
Wait, what kind of debt would be canceled?
debt that countries owe each other?
Well, you already had that occur in 1931. After World War II, the United States insisted that the Allies pay for all of the U.S. arms exports that they'd made before America entered World War I. And so the Allies said, okay, if we have to pay America, we have to get the money from Germany, and they imposed reparations on Germany. This is the story that I've described in my book, Super Imperialism. Mm-hmm. And so the result is that this debt tangle ended up causing a whole breakdown. The stock market crashed in 1929. The economy began to move into the Great Depression. By 1931, all the governments of the creditor and debtor countries got together and said, okay, it's not worth creating a whole depression throughout the world, the Western world, just to pay the war debts left over from World War I. We're going to have a moratorium on the war debts. Well, by that time, it was already too late to have to prevent the depression from developing. And the world emerged from World War II pretty much without debt. And the German economic miracle in 1947 was when they canceled all of the internal German debts. Well, that was pretty easy because the debts were all owed to people who'd been Nazis. The rich people had got their wealth during the Nazi era, so you were really canceling the debts to the Nazis. That became the only debts that were kept were employer debts to their employees, and everybody was allowed to keep a modicum of bank accounts just so that they could continue to do business and start again. So you had the Allies cancel the German debts. And then again, you had the debts begin to mount up from 1945. By 1980, already, it was obvious that the debts couldn't be paid. I wrote a number of reports for UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, showing that the Global South debts couldn't be paid. And indeed, in 1982, Mexico defaulted, and then one Latin American country after another defaulted. So under the Brady Plan, the debts were written down quite a bit. So of course, the debts can be written down. And right now, we're in a situation again, because of the America's war, NATO war against Russia and China and Iran. You have oil prices going way up, interest rates going way up, and you have the Global South and many East Asian countries unable, and African countries unable to pay their foreign debt. So at least this time, they don't have to let the West cancel the debts. They're joining together in the BRICS Plus and the whole group around them, the global majority, creating an alternative set of institutions. They're de-dollarizing their economies. But de-dollarizing means we're getting rid not only of the dollar, but of the dollar debts we have. And we're moving towards a point where there will be an alternative to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And these countries, by joining together, can just repudiate the dollar debts in a great debt cancellation. So yes, of course, countries can join together.
So in the collapse of antiquity, do you see signs of similar social, political, and economic developments happening right now, particularly in the West, or what sometimes people call the global North, at least?
Well, it's become more and more obvious that if you don't cancel the predatory debts, you're going to have debt austerity. Mm-hmm. Already in the 30s, the idea of debt deflation was voiced, and we're in debt deflation again. More and more of the income of the United States and Europe is paid to creditors, and yes. The creditors have they've taken over the real estate sector, the insurance sector. You have really what I call the fire sector. Finance, insurance, and real estate are a rentier sector. You have a rentier class, including the monopolies now, that are all getting predatory income. In the West, this that we're moving into what some people are calling neo-feudalism, because they can see that, well, we're moving back into this kind of polarized economy, and if you don't prevent a financial oligarchy from emerging and taking over, then it's you're going to have happen here just what happened in Rome. You're going to have a dark age when all the money's at the very top of the pyramid, and you've killed the domestic market, you've killed growth, and you have the population fleeing. And in the Roman Empire, more and more of the at the periphery, more and more Romans were joining the barbarians, because it was the Romans who were barbarians, and the barbarians were more civilized. They were the German tribes that were very egalitarian. They were the Germanic tribes. You had a whole different ethic than the decadent Roman ethic. Well, you're having that same split today between the what the European Union head Joseph Borrell calls the European garden, as opposed to the jungle everywhere out there. The jungle is really democracy. The European garden is autocracy, but the Americans say that the autocracy is the democracy is anyone who supports the American autocracy, and autocracy is anyone government that plays a role in moderating and preventing an oligarchy from developing and being what the spirit of democracy is supposed to be all about. So we're in a kind of world of Orwellian doublethink today. But yes, the way to promote this, it takes a revolution, and the role of the economic profession is to say there's no alternative. We're in the end of history. End of history is by Darwinian survival. We have the wealthy rentiers, Wall Street, City of England, the Paris Bourse, Frankfurt, Bank of Tokyo. This is really the apex of history. We've won by the survival of the fittest, and we don't have to go anymore. And so there's no alternative. Well, you have the whole rest of the world now, thanks to the the NATO war against Russia and Ukraine, and now the Near Eastern mess. You have the whole world saying this is wrong, morally wrong. We're going to make a new society, and that is the feeling that there is something morally wrong. You realize that what used to be religion in the West is economic neoliberalism. Free markets, meaning free for the oligarchy to do whatever it wants with its riches, and free from any government attempt to tax or to regulate the economy, to prevent monopoly rents, to tax land rent, and to make money and credit a public function instead of a privatized function. So you're having finally that awareness that Margaret Thatcher was wrong. There is an alternative. And if you don't take it, you're going to end up through the West, just the way England ended up under Margaret Thatcher and her follower, Tony Blair, that tried to go even further than Thatcher did in privatizing transportation and basically destroying the British economy.